Well, grade 10. So we see each other again. Nice to hear from you and to get all the homework that you sent. I was totally overwhelmed, and I think that the administration of Chuvanan were also very pleased. Clearly, there's been a big improvement. I think that you now realize the seriousness of the situation, and probably your parents are getting you to work hard, and hopefully you are inspired as well. But I was really, really pleased with the 100% homework that has been sent in from grade 10 class. This is definitely the best class that I've had for a long time. We're all suffering a little bit, obviously, with the coronavirus. We're now not able to even sort of leave our house except to buy food. And now here in Eco Park, the buses have stopped. Things are a bit grim, but clearly this is a challenge and an opportunity for us to show Ho Chi Minh that we're serious in taking responsibility and to to help Vietnam as a whole, and certainly by staying home and incubating yourself and sort of staying in your home and not spreading any disease or virus, that we are making Ho Chi Minh proud. So for that, I just want to say keep safe, wear your mask, and hopefully this whole situation will be over sooner rather than later. I actually went out and bought a microphone, and I think this is going to make the audio a little bit better. I don't know. You can tell me whether it's better or not. And I think that the problem I noticed before was when I was talking to the laptop, that the audio would be okay, but if I moved a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, that suddenly that this would make the audio drop, and it would be difficult for you to hear my voice. So I went out to a place called Hanoi Computer. I don't know if you ever heard of it before. It has about 100 different types of microphones, and this one seemed good value for money. And I'm hoping that it will make the audio better because, as we know from our little project that we did last year, that audio really means everything. That if you don't have audio, then your video doesn't really count for very much because nobody wants to just look at your face. They want to hear what you have to say. I just want to make a comment. I've had a few people write and wanted to know why they were getting a zero for some things, and clearly, if you if you do get a zero, then just rewrite it, make it better, and I will remark it, and you can improve your mark. I think that usually there's probably a mistake because there's only a couple of words on the paper that you sent me, and I assume that that's not what you had intended to do. So that's really why I gave a zero. So don't worry about it. Just redo the work that I gave you a zero for, and then everything should be okay. And to be honest, the marks have been pretty good because your work has been certainly above average. I had a couple of questions, so I want to go over some of the questions. I want to share the questions with you from various students in grade 10. The first question that you sent me was, why do Keynesians feel strongly about fiscal policies? And that's a good question. I think I went over it before, but it's really fiscal policies is really what Keynesians are all about. They see the world in a certain way, and they certainly see the world in terms of promoting greater equity and reducing unemployment, for example. and they see fiscal policies as the best strategy to achieve those objectives. So, for that reason, you could argue that Keynesians feel strongly about fiscal policies because, for example, through progressive taxation, where the percentage of tax will go up as your income goes up, this is a well trodden strategy around the world to make society more equal. I mean, Canada 100 years ago was an incredibly unequal society where you had either you were, wealthy business owners, or you were workers who were almost starving to death. And just through the process of progressive taxation, where you can, increase people's income tax to ensure that everybody shares in the burden of finding government revenue, it's meant that Canada today is a much more equal society than it was 100 years ago. Now, there's other issues. Obviously, now that we're moving away from direct taxation towards indirect taxation, then that ability of Keynesians to influence or, a bit of social engineering in order to create a more equitable society has become somewhat less. But on the whole, I would say that Keynesians see this as like a central theme of their strategy. They see fiscal policies as the main catalyst. The word catalyst is like a chemistry word, where it's like the main uh, instigator or the main sort of process by which you can achieve certain objectives. And certainly, reducing unemployment, by spending in a way that, promotes public works projects and gets money into the hands of workers and to get it into the circular flow, and then et cetera, et cetera. We all know the story that this is what the Keynesians are all about. So to answer your question, that's why they feel strongly about fiscal policies. The second question is, how do monetarists see fiscal policies? And I think that I went over that as well. I mean, monetarists, these are usually conservatives or business owners or high income people. These are people who definitely believe that, fiscal policies is not the main priority of their strategies, but they do believe that they need to do it. I mean, obviously, everybody has to raise government revenue, and every government, no matter whether left wing or right wing, has to spend, the people's money in order to achieve what the government wants to achieve. But certainly, they don't see it in the same way. They don't see it as a way to promote equity, because as we know from the Lorenz curve and the Laffer curve, that monetarists don't seem to feel that this is a great priority, the idea of an equal society. And, I'm sure that many of you in the class, you probably don't see, equality necessarily as the main priority in society. I mean, do we want to live in a perfectly equal society? I mean, I tend to be sympathetic to that argument, but maybe you are not. So for that reason, the monetarists would probably use the fiscal policies as a strategy or as an opportunity to kind of shrink the money supply. And you could do that, for example, by taxing and spending in a way that would actually make less money available in the circular flow, and therefore, the economy would be run more efficiently, or that's how they would see it, and that they would see the opportunity of making the economy more business oriented, so that foreign investment would come into the country, and that businesses would be profitable, and that you would have a more business-friendly, economy. And that's really what monetarists are looking for. Their priority, of course, is the money supply and how they can sort of arrange the money supply. But clearly, they have to deal with the fiscal policies as well. And so, of course, what they would see their priority is what they refer to as contractionary fiscal policies, where you could use fiscal policies in a way that would contract or make smaller the economy. And that's what monetarists are all about. Okay, so let's go to the handout. Okay, some of you actually answered I was I don't know if impressed or you're so keen that you want to, you want to answer the handout before you need to. But the idea is that I normally give on the Friday, I give the handout so that you have the weekend to read it and to think about it and say, oh, okay, now on Monday, Mr. Christopher is going to produce another video and he's going to talk about the handout. So let's wait for the video, and then with the video and the handout, then probably I'm going to understand the topic a lot better. So that's what probably you should be doing. So I'm very flattered that there's about 6 of you who have already completed the homework, but I would recommend that you wait for the video and then answer the questions at the end of the handout after both reading the handout and seeing the video. Okay, so let's see, what does the handout have to see? So I have on a big computer monitor in front of me, I have the handout that I've sent to everybody. It was all about monetary policies, and there's like a little diagram with 2 arrows going up. You should have that handout in your hand right now, and you should have read it by now. It talks about expansionist and contractionary monetary policies. So right away, I would suggest that the monetarists are probably promoting contractionary strategies, while Keynesians, who, although they don't see monetary policy as the #1 priority, they still have to get involved with the money supply. They would look for opportunities to expand the money supply, and that's why they would be referred to as, implementing expansionist monetary policies. That's for the Keynesians, but as I say, the monetarists would definitely be contractionary. So first of all, what is the definition? Monetary policy is the manipulation by the government of the money supply in order to promote a macroeconomic agenda. Well, that's a good definition. I've been in this business for a long, long time, and I would say sometimes the definitions are kind of, unclear. But I would say that this is a really good definition, and it really helps us to understand what they're talking about. And so usually the money supply is something that the Minister of Finance is really dealing with. And certainly the Minister of Finance, whether male or female, that they would see this as part of their toolbox. If you can imagine economists being a car mechanic, he has a toolbox in his hand, and what does he have to solve macroeconomic problems, whether it's equity or inflation or unemployment or whatever? And so he sees it as a way to manipulate these monetary policies to promote a particular agenda. So you notice that the definition doesn't necessarily say that they're trying to shrink or expand the money supply, because that depends on who you are. But it's basically to promote a macroeconomic agenda, and that's what it's all about. They give a bit of examples, things like interest rates. Okay, so you have a situation where interest rates would definitely have an influence on the money supply. Why? Because obviously, if the interest rates are lower, this makes borrowing cheaper. And if it's cheaper to borrow the money, then probably more people will borrow. And if everybody is borrowing, that would imply that there's a lot more money in circulation in the economy. Okay. And that's something that is often used as a strategy. That's probably the number one. If I had to choose one, I'd say that interest rates are often manipulated, to affect monetary policies. So this is true even today. If you've been reading the newspapers because of the coronavirus and the economies around the world are crashing, we would find that most governments now are lowering the interest rates. In fact, some countries have gotten into negative interest rates, which I'll be honest with you, I don't understand it. I don't understand how you can have a negative interest rate. I don't understand it. That's almost like a negative interest rate means that, the customer is expecting money in order to borrow, which is ridiculous. So, I mean, even though like in Canada right now, I think it's about 1% or half of 1%, which is incredibly low. What the government is doing by promoting this policy is trying to get people to spend, because now the shopping malls are closed, the cinemas are closed, everything is crashing now in Canada. And all these businesses, which, used to be really, really profitable, now have no revenue at all. And as we talked about in the last handout, we talked about this very topic about sort of profits and et cetera, et cetera. That if you have fixed costs, like a building, like if you have a cinema, but you don't have any customers, then you still have to pay for the building, and you're losing money big time. And so people are going bankrupt. And so obviously, if this is going to take maybe 6 months or a year, obviously a lot of businesses are incredibly worried about the future of their wealth, about their money. So all these rich people are running around like a chicken without a head, saying, oh my God, the sky is coming down because I'm going to lose all my money. And so for that reason, we have to reflect exactly on, what can governments do? Everybody points to the government saying, well, you need to solve this problem. Well, for the first time in my life, I probably feel a bit sorry for governments because, first of all, where are governments going to find all this money? Are they going to borrow all this money to pay everybody to stay at home? I don't know. I don't know how it's going to work out. This is the first time in anybody's memory of such a situation that took place. In fact, the last time a major virus took place was in 1918, just after World War I. It was called the Spanish flu. And I don't want to scare anybody, but it actually took the lives of 50 million people. Of course, today, our understanding of flus and viruses are a lot deeper, and therefore we know what to do. But in those days in 1918, people just had no idea, and they would just pray to God a lot. And before then, you had things like the plague in the 13th century, where half of the population of London died even, and they started to redraw the whole map of London based on demography and how so many people had died. I'm not trying to scare anybody or give you the impression that we're in that type of situation, but certainly, the governments feel they need to do something to try to prevent a total collapse of their economy. So what they're doing is they are lowering the interest rates to get people to borrow and hoping that people are going to go out and spend. And as we know, that spending is 70% of the GDP. So to save the economy, they're trying to get people to spend. What's another example is certainly quantitative easing, QE. That's a big word. If you ask everybody in Chuvanan, all the teachers, they wouldn't know what quantitative easing is all about. Probably your parents don't know either. And so this is a big word, which essentially means that you're kind of like printing money to solve your macroeconomic problems. You're not really printing money as such. What you're really doing is you're buying government bonds, but effectively, you're buying your own bonds, the government is, and by doing so, you're kind of printing more money. So if you're actually in a big, you're in a big trouble, and you've got huge unemployment, and you think your economy is crashing, then the easiest thing is to sort of do a bit of quantitative easing. Now, as I said in the handout there, this was almost unheard of when I was your age. In fact, it was unheard of. It was really only in the 1990s when Bill Clinton, who was the president of the United States at the time, he decided that he wanted both low unemployment and low inflation at the same time. And monetarists, of course, said that's not possible. That they believe in this idea that if you have high, if you want low unemployment, you're going to have high inflation, and if you want to have low inflation, you have to have high unemployment. And in some ways, Bill Clinton in the 1990s proved that that was all wrong, and that you could, in fact, through the process of quantitative easing, get people to spend and to reduce unemployment. And he argued the case that companies who would start to rebuild and to start building new production capacities would also be able to take advantage of economies of scale. So when these companies are kind of responding to all this new money by building greater production capacity, what they're also doing is making the cost per unit cheaper as production increases. And by doing so, you're able to keep the prices down. So what he achieved was this idea that quantitative easing was not such a bad idea after all, particularly for a huge economy like the United States. Because if you're actually printing maybe a couple of $1 billion, that may not be so much if you consider that the American economy might be like $10 trillion. Then a couple of billion maybe doesn't have too much of an effect. But obviously, in a smaller economy, this is a much more dangerous strategy and could eventually become inflationary. So I lived in Zimbabwe in southern Africa for 5 years, and that's exactly what happened. The government decided to print more money, and what happened was that the prices just went up, and it just continued to keep going up until you had like millions of percent inflation, doubling every day. Which is a huge crisis where the moment you get paid, you have to spend all the money that you receive because tomorrow the prices will be twice as high. Nobody saves any money in this type of hyperinflation. So, there is a danger. There is a danger, and monetarists are really, really weary or careful about quantitative easing, and you'll probably find that most monitors will be against this strategy. They're not prepared to take the risk of letting inflation get out of control. Also, things like exchange rates, as I say in the handout, inflation targets, reserve ratios, and the discount rate. These are all strategies where you could somehow affect the money supply. Okay, so obviously, if you start manipulating the exchange rate, you probably manipulate it to make the exchange rate appear to be more valuable, and therefore you would be appreciating, not depreciating the currency. And there's a danger in that but there could be some short-term benefits. Your inflation targets, you could say, well, I consider 5% inflation to be acceptable. So, you could actually somehow rationalize flooding the market with money by saying, well, really, 5%, or you could subjectively you could say, well, I think 10% is okay, or 20%. I mean, who's to say if a prime minister whose interest it is to convince the population that inflation is kind of okay, they're going to manipulate the inflation targets to convince people that the economy is not out of control. Reserve ratios, I think we talked about it a bit. Reserve ratio being that, this is an amount of money that the government requires you to keep in the banks in the form of dead money. Okay, so in Canada, I think it's about 7% of the money of the total assets of banks is kept in the vaults and is not allowed to be lent out to other people. Of course, the banks go crazy; they hate it. But the bottom line is that governments usually don't trust the banks. They believe that given the opportunity, banks will lend every single dollar or dong to customers because that's what their business is. They have no interest in keeping money behind the counter in the vault doing nothing. And to be told that you have to keep 7%, of your total assets of the bank sitting around doing nothing would be obviously a huge disaster. Now, governments, depending on whether you're a monetarist or a Keynesian, you're probably going to use the reserve ratio as a means of manipulating the money supply. So if you want less money circulating, in other words, you're probably a monetarist, then what you're going to do is you are going to raise the reserve ratio. So maybe it used to be 7%. Well, now you're going to make it 10%. Why are you going to make it 10%? Because you believe that an increase in the amount of money being held by the bank will mean that the bank will be able to lend out less money to customers, and this will mean that there will be less money circulating in the economy. So that would be good if your objective is to control inflation, to reduce the velocity of the circular flow. But Keynesians, obviously, they're going to want to do the opposite. And they believe that somehow by lowering the reserve ratio, you enable banks to lend out more. And that money will go into the hands of people and they will start spending. And finally, we talk about the discount rate. I was reading some economic textbooks during the weekend. You guys probably are watching television or playing computer games in your spare time. I tend to read economic textbooks, which shows what a boring guy I really am. But I noticed that Americans tend to use the term the base rate while the British tend to use the term the discount rate. So I don't want any confusion, so that I better use both terms. So the discount rate or the base rate basically is the interest that the central bank charges to commercial banks when they lend commercial banks money. Okay, so when the commercial bank runs out of money to lend out to customers at maybe 17-20%, where do they get extra money? Well, they get the extra money by borrowing money at a much lower interest rate, maybe at 5% from the central bank. And so they can borrow it from the central bank and then they lend it out at 17% or 20%. So the difference between the two is their profit. So why does the central bank do that? Well, because central banks want people to spend, they want their GDP to increase, and so they don't want the banks to be starved of money, and so that's what they do. In fact, it's one of the main raison d'etre, we say in French, the reason to be The main purpose of the central bank is the banker's bank. Okay, so when the bankers, the commercial bank people, they need money, where do they go? They go to the central bank and they borrow money from the central bank. And depending on whether you're trying to expand the money supply or shrink the money supply, you are going to change the discount rate. But as Americans refer to it as the base rate, so I don't want to confuse things. So the quantitative easing has become a more common macro strategy to increase aggregate demand since the 1990s, after it was frequently used by President Bill Clinton without too many negative consequences. Essentially, it refers to the central government buying financial assets such as bonds in exchange for money from commercial banks. This has the result of printing new money for the liquidity-strapped government, liquidity meaning cash, which may need cash to pay for short-term requirements such as paying off debt from the IMF, paying teachers on strike, or just simply as a means to increase the velocity of the circular flow and increasing consumption to stimulate the GDP. So, although monetarists view monetary policies to be their main strategies to implement their economic agenda, Keynesians too need to use monetary policies, but less enthusiastically, to ensure that they can control the amount of money circulating in the economy. Keynesians would probably be more enthusiastic with expansionary monetary policies, and that should be obvious, with the objective of expanding the money supply, while monetarists, on the other hand, tend to prefer contractionary monetary policies, which would control or reduce the money supply to avoid any possibility of inflation. Expansionary monetary policies could be implemented by lowering the interest rates. Yeah, that's correct. I was thinking, is that correct? Yes. Expansionary monetary policies, which would probably be done by Keynesians, would be done by implementing lower interest rates, which would increase the aggregate demand and so raise the GDP and short-term growth, allowing inflation to rise, attempting to lower unemployment. So Keynesians normally see unemployment as more important than inflation. Which might also lead to deterioration on the current account of the balance of payments. So you may actually find Keynesians might get themselves into debt more quickly than the monetarists. On the other hand, and this is the monetarist perspective, contractionary monetary policies, where you're kind of shrinking the money supply, may reduce inflation and lead to an improvement in the current account, but unfortunately, it might also cause unemployment to rise and to lower economic growth. So it depends on what your priorities are. Okay, so for homework, we got 3 questions. I think they're pretty easy questions. Okay, I think I've gone over it in this video, and there's quite a bit of information in the textbook as well. If the Central Bank of Vietnam announced today that it is putting up the interest rates by 1%, make a list of 10 different ways in which this might have an impact on the economy. Okay, so number 1, obviously, it would affect inflation. Okay, and you could say how it would affect inflation. Then it might affect unemployment, and then da 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 da. You keep and think of 10. Okay, I think that I could probably think of 20. So if I can think of 20, you can think of 10. Okay. What is quantitative easing? Okay, that's a fairly easy question because I've kind of answered the question in the handout. And why is it a risky policy in order to stimulate economic growth? Okay, it is risky. Okay, and we talked about that in this video. And a lot of monetarists go crazy when you talk about it. You say QE to a monetarist and they go nuts. So they would say, no, 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 no. You're taking a risk with the whole economy. So that's definitely something that they don't want to hear. So why is it? Why is it that many people believe that quantitative easing is a risky policy? Obviously, sometimes if it seems so easy to print more money, you might continue to do it and continue and continue and continue. And maybe you're going to end up with a situation like Zimbabwe. So talk about that in your answer. And then finally, using your own economic knowledge, and I'm trying to leave this one up to you to give an analysis, okay? Discuss whether, in your opinion, monetary policy can be as effective as fiscal policy in stimulating demand in the economy. Now that's almost worthy of a 4 paragraph answer, because obviously, you got to explain in the first paragraph, what is monetary policy and what is fiscal policy. And then in paragraph 2, you can kind of agree. You can say, yeah, I agree that monetary policy can be as effective. Okay. And then in paragraph 3, you say, well, no, on the other hand, I think that's wrong, and explain why monetary policy is much less effective than fiscal policy. And then paragraph 4, just give me your own opinion, talk a little bit about Vietnam, give me a graph, and that would be exactly what the Cambridge Examiner is looking for. So that's it for today. So I've enjoyed getting together with you again. I want you to stay safe. I want you to wear your mask. I want you to love your mother and love your father. And I'm going to see you again next week. So bye bye for now. Bye bye.